There's 3 people online.
All right, I am showing that we have started the event. Folks are muted, and you'll need to unmute if you need to say anything. And I appreciate y'all's patience as we work with this technology.
Great. Well, I'll just do a brief kickoff. It's 6:30. We can let folks trickle in if some more come in, but this is really going to be the CodeWrite consultants leading this effort tonight, Chad Meadows and Karen Mallow with CodeWrite planners. The purpose of tonight is to do a deep dive into the final version of the code diagnosis. We talked about this a little bit briefly when the consultant was out here in February. We had some preliminary discussions about it, and so tonight is really a deep dive into the final document, get your feedback on some of the thematic recommendations for the new ordinance. And with that, I'll turn it over to Chad and Karen.
Thanks, Mike. Good evening, everybody. It's great to see you guys. Thank you so much for the chance to present this code diagnosis to you. Karen Mallow is with us, and she is running the controls. So I'm going to give it over to her for discussion about how we'll go forward. So Karen, please.
Hello, everyone. Joining you this evening remotely as well. Just wanted to go over a little bit of our sort of procedures for this evening. So again, welcome to the webinar. This is for the Imagine Mill Rivers code diagnosis. The presentation is going to be made by Chad Meadows. And as mentioned, we are the consultants hired by the town to assist in the preparation of the UDO. I'll be moderating the presentation and incoming questions, and Chad will be running the show. As a webinar, this is a little different than our typical online meetings. So participants' microphones and cameras have been disabled. If you have any questions, we're going to ask you that you put those into the Q&A dialog box. So at the top of your screen, the third one over, you should say Q&A. It's a little question mark. That's going to open a dialog box on the side of the screen where you can ask questions and read the other questions that have been posted. And then we'll pause throughout the presentation to ask Chad to respond to some of those questions. So that's the way we're going to kind of work it tonight so that Chad can get through all the materials. And then if there's some time at the end, we'll do some question and, more question and answers, more general. So I'm going to turn it over to Chad and let him go.
Thank you, Karen.
Real quick before you begin, we have 5 members here in the room, and we're all using one computer, so we're not able to type all those answers in. So if we can just build in a few pauses for the folks here to just speak out loud, that'd be great.
Sure, absolutely.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And I mentioned before we go any further that we are recording this. It's our intention to share this video, whether that's through the Town of Mills Rivers YouTube site or the CodeWrite YouTube site. Not sure yet. We'll figure that out, but there'll be a link on the project website for this. And I really appreciate y'all's willingness to allow us to explore this technology and work with you on it. It's hopefully a way that we'll be able to spend more time with you and have more dialogue. So thank you for that. With that, I'm going to make sure, can everybody see my screen? There should be the front page of the Imagine Mills River PowerPoint on my screen. Can folks see that?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Very good. Very good. All right. As Karen mentioned, I will stop every so often, and we'll have some time for questions and discussion. We are slated to meet for about an hour and a half, 2 hours. And so, if we are done at an hour and a half, that would be fantastic for everybody. So, but if we need to go over, that's great. We're happy to do that. Also, I'll just comment that, this isn't the last bite at the apple. I know that you guys haven't had much time with this document. Our intention is to overview this with you tonight. And if you have follow-up questions or comments to make in the next few days, absolutely feel free to do that. In several instances, I'm going to refer to specific pages in the code diagnosis document. Hopefully you've got a copy in front of you. But if not, you'll have the recording and we can go from there. So with that, I'm going to jump in, and here we go. So tonight, I'm going to talk a little bit about the project status, where we are. As always, I'll go over the project goals. We always talk about those, give you a little bit of background on the code diagnosis itself, what it is, what's in it, etc. The bulk of our discussion tonight will focus on the key themes for improvement, the 7 key themes that are embedded in the code diagnosis itself. And then we'll wrap up with next steps and kind of where we go from here. So this is our agenda for this evening. So project status. This is the project schedule wheel. We are in task 2. This is the last piece of task 2. For those of you who are smart with dates, you'll note that this task was supposed to be done in February of 2025, and that we should be in the annotated outline phase of the project right now. That was our intention at the end of last year, but as many of you know, we've had some challenging legislation proposed at the end of 2024 in December, and then some sort of continuing concerns this year. And to be honest with you, it makes a lot of sense for us and for Mills River to slow walk this a little bit and kind of let the dust settle. And let me explain what I mean. So you see some numbers and letters on the screen here. That gobbledygook is a series of bill numbers that the General Assembly has been working on or has passed recently. And we're going to talk about each one of them very quickly. The first is SL 2024-57. That stands for Session Law 2024-57. And that bill was passed mid-December of 2024, around about the time we were getting ready to start the code diagnosis work. And this bill basically is affectionately referred to as the downzoning bill. This bill was passed by both chambers of the General Assembly, and what it did, we talked about this last time, was make it illegal for local governments to downzone property, reduce residential densities, change the range of allowable uses in a zoning district, or adopt new standards that might create non-conforming development that exists on non-residential zoning districts. So this is a pretty impactful piece of legislation. And it threw everybody across the state for a loop, as it basically requires local governments to now obtain written consent before initiating any text amendment or map amendment that would amount to a downzoning as it was defined in Session Law 2024-57. Needless to say, there's been a lot of concern about this bill on behalf of local governments across the state. And we have seen in 2025 a handful of legislation and different legislative approaches to deal with the downzoning bill. And so the first one that I'll speak of is Senate Bill 587. Senate Bill 587 basically repeals or seeks to repeal the requirement that local governments obtain consent before taking action that amounts to a downzoning. So it sets the clock back to before December of 2024 for local governments. And this bill has passed the Senate. It is still under consideration. It made crossover, but it has not moved in the House. Okay, so this is where we are with Senate Bill 587. There is a bill to repeal the downzoning provision. It has passed one chamber. It has not yet passed the second chamber. Okay, there are a handful of other bills across the state. There's a couple statewide repeal bills. House Bill, I think 24, Senate Bill 419, seek to repeal the non-conforming bill, the downzoning bill, but neither of those bills have moved forward, and people are sort of hanging their hopes on Senate Bill 587. Okay, let's talk about the next one in line, which is HB 183. This is a very important bill for Mills River. And the reason why this bill is important is this is the local exemption bill for Mills River that would exempt Mills River from these downzoning consent requirements. And so regardless of whether or not Senate Bill 587 passes the House or not, HB 183 is moving. Mike, I believe you mentioned to me that this bill passed the House today. Is that accurate?
It passed the third reading in the Senate with some amendments, but the Town of Mills River UDO exemption survived those amendments. So it's going back to the House for concurrence because of the committee substitutes, and that would be the last action, I believe.
Right. Okay, so that's great news for us. What that means is this bill has passed both chambers. It's now in reconciliation because a committee substitute made some changes to it. But I think we can all be fairly confident that Mills River will be exempted from the downzoning consent requirements that were embedded in Session Law 2024-57. So believe me when I say to you that that is a real victory. I don't know that many local governments across the state who have secured exemption from the downzoning provisions. So congratulations to everybody. It will absolutely make a huge difference for us in this project. So that's great. I want to mention a couple other things to you for us to keep an eye on. And the first of those is House Bill 765. This bill has been revised and renamed a few times. It is now referred to as the Saving the American Dream Act. And it does 5 things that are deeply, deeply impactful to local governments across the state. First and foremost among those, it limits local regulations to those in the statutes. In other words, local governments would not be able to adopt and enforce development regulations that were more restrictive than any of those expressly stated in the statutes. So, you know, if you had environmental provisions that you wanted to adopt, but that the statutes didn't recognize or include, then you would not be able to adopt those. That's the first thing that this HB 765 bill does, but there's more. The second important thing is that this bill removes the broad interpretation provisions about police power that are embedded in the Dillon's Rule lexicon. You guys may recall we had this conversation a few months back. North Carolina is a Dillon's Rule state. Generally speaking, that means local governments cannot adopt regulations that are not expressly authorized in the general statutes. However, sections 153A4 and 160A4 of the general statutes do include broad interpretation provisions that allow local governments to adopt regulations that differ from the statutes as authorized by their police power that's granted to every local government in the state by the statutes. Okay, so this bill removes police power and removes that broad interpretation authority. And so this is an attempt to limit local government's autonomy with respect to preparation and enforcement of development regulations. But that's not all. This bill also removes any ordinance making authority and the ability to abate nuisances as identified in section 160D 174 of the general statutes. So not only have we lost police power, we've also lost the ability to make ordinance changes or abate nuisances. this is a real problem with this bill, and I'm not sure that this was intended, but it is very much included in the legislation. Further, you may recall or seen in your travels that in North Carolina, local governments are authorized to control development for the purposes of protecting the public health, safety, and welfare. That is the base essence of why we have development regulations in the first place. This bill, HB 765, removes that language and requires local governments to demonstrate adequacy and the necessity for any sort of development regulation. So they remove that broad interpretation and the protection of police power and now compel local governments to demonstrate necessity for any sort of ordinance changes that they might propose. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, House Bill 765 bars or prohibits the application of conditions of approval that are not specified in the general statutes. And so, for example, a few years ago, local governments were barred from applying building design standards to 1 and 2 family homes. You cannot regulate garage placement, exterior materials, windows and door location, etc., on 1 and 2 family structures in North Carolina. Now, at the time that bill was approved, the General Assembly incorporated the ability of local governments to use conditional zoning to regulate those things, provided the applicant agreed with those conditions. Okay, so while it was true that as a rule, local governments could not regulate building design features through the conditional rezoning process, local governments were permitted to do that, provided they had the voluntary consent of the applicant. 765 is significant in that it removes the ability of local governments to use conditional zoning to regulate design or any other aspect of development that's not expressly authorized in the statutes. Further, this bill bars local governments from accepting conditions proposed by applicants that go beyond the statutes. So no longer can local governments negotiate with applicants or applicants negotiate with local governments to have conditional rezoning developments that are approved that differ from the general statutes. 765 is deeply, deeply impactful to all local governments in the state. If you thought Session Law 2024-57 was a problem, it has very little on what's going on with House Bill 765. So just giving you notice about that. There's one more bill on the list there, Senate Bill 205, and the reason that's up there is because House Bill 765 has not passed one of the chambers in the General Assembly, did not make crossover. There are some inclusion of water sewer kind of allocation system provisions that exempted it from the kind of crossover date requirement. Nonetheless, as of 2 days ago, Senate Bill 205, which was a swimming pool bill, has now been modified, and all of the provisions that were in House Bill 765 have been inserted into Senate Bill 205. So I wanted to share that information with you. We do have good news about Session Law 2024-57 and the loss or the removal of the downzoning, but we are not out of the woods yet, gang. We still have problems with House Bill 765 and Senate Bill 205, and those challenges could impact our ability to successfully prepare and enforce a UDO. And so I want you to know that, and that's one of the reasons why we're a little behind in our schedule. Okay. Sorry for that very long discussion, but I think it's very important that everybody understand the situation that we're in right now.
Hey,
So,
Chad.
yes,
Chad, we
ma'am.
have a question. We have a hand raised.
All right, please.
Hold on.
I think they can.
I have to allow, hold on.
Okay.
Lisa, you can unmute yourself and then speak.
patience with us, Lisa, as we try to figure this out. I'm gonna go
Yeah,
to
Lisa, if you can hear us, we
Okay,
ask that.
yeah.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
yes.
Yes.
Thanks. I just wanted to circle back. I think, forgive me if I get the bill wrong. Maybe it was Senate Bill 587, the one that allows the exemption from Mills River.
That's HB 183. Yes.
Okay, sorry. Okay, HB 183. Can you just clarify? I believe there was more than one wording out there with regard to the exemption for Mills River. Is that a full exemption, or was that the exemption that was kind of tied to agricultural use?
Fantastic question. This is a full exemption. This is not the agricultural use provision that we saw in HB, I think it was HB 29.
Okay, amazing. Thank you.
Go ahead, Mike. Mike may know more about this than I do, so.
It is an exemption, but only for the Unified Development Ordinance project.
What does that mean?
That's true. So it is an exemption. Yeah, it is an exemption for this project. It basically states the downzoning does not apply to the UDO as long as we adopt it before July 1st of 26. And that is the language in the law or the bill.
Okay.
I understand that as a full exemption, Lisa.
Okay, so meaning that as long as we implement the type of zoning that we want in connection with the UDO process before July of 2026, we will be able to change our quote or adjust zoning.
Yes.
In the way that would otherwise be viewed as downzoning.
Yes. We'll be able to do this without consent. Now, what happens after July 1st, 2026? I mean, I think we'll have law on the books. The real question is what happens, say, in 2027 or 2028 when it's time to revise the regulations, which happens. Will they try to attempt to prevent you from doing that, or say, oh, well, you'll have to get consent? We don't know yet. I think we should take the position that we are exempted from the consent requirement that's set down in 160D 601 sub D and leave it at that.
Thank you for addressing that.
It's a great question. Okay, unless there's any other questions, I'm going to move on to next slide. Okay. Project goals. We always go over these. Obviously, protecting community character, vital. Implementing Making Mills River, the 2040 comprehensive plan, vital. A user-friendly code that's easy to follow, easy to read. Protecting the environment, more housing options. Promoting development quality, and modernizing uses. These are our project goals. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these. We'll talk more about many of these topics when we get into the key themes for improvement. But these are our guardrails, our touchstone. All right. So the code diagnosis. What in the heck is this thing? This is the roadmap for the new UDO. It explores the gap between the policy guidance in Making Mills River and the current development regulations. In other words, Making Mills River says what we want to be when we grow up. Our current regulations are kind of where we are right now. There's a gap between those. The comprehensive plan wants us to do a great many things which the current regulations do not contemplate as of yet. And so we've got gaps there that we want to fill, and the code diagnosis assesses those gaps and gives some recommendations about how to close those. It also gives us a framework for discussion about how the development rules should be updated, okay? And then finally makes recommendations for change. And there are, I don't know, 50, 60 recommendations for change that are identified in the code diagnosis. At the end of the day, as we move through this process, we may see many more, but we're coming in at about 60-ish right now. Okay. So the code diagnosis itself is about 100 pages long. It's got an executive summary of the key themes for improvement on page 1. So all you really need to look at, if you hate long documents, is just look at page 1. In that are the 7 key themes for improvement, and the various recommendations included within each of those 7. Pages 2 through 6 give a project introduction, explain what we're doing and why. The bulk of the document, pages 7 through 35, are the key themes for improvement themselves, and we're going to cover those in detail. One of the things that we're not going to cover tonight in detail, but that I really encourage you to take some time and review, is the appendix. So the appendix has 3 pieces to it. First among those are the ordinance review tables from pages 37 to 77. So about 40 pages of table here. These pages go through the 8 town code of ordinance chapters that exist right now: zoning, subdivision, manufactured homes, vested rights, environment, natural resources, etc., and assesses what's in those various chapters, and how and in what ways that language might be revised to come into closer alignment with Making Mills River, the input we've received from the community up to this point, state law, jurisprudence, best practice and development regulation, etc. So very, very important section. If you have trouble sleeping, it'll be very helpful, put you right out. But that is very much a roadmap for exactly precisely the ways that we would suggest the current development regulations be changed. This appendix also includes the stakeholder interview summary. Task 1 in the project was a series of 9 stakeholder interviews, and pages 78 to 85 give you some detail on what was discussed and the input that we received at that time. Finally, the last part of the appendix is the report on public forum 1. You may recall in late February, we were out in Mills River, and we had a 2-day public forum where we had some boards and we asked some questions and so forth. There's about 10 pages of summary there with respect to the things that we heard. If you came to any of the public forums, you got your dots and you put your dots on the boards and you wrote your Post-it notes. All of that information is set down in those 10 pages. And the report will also be posted on the project webpage in the form of trip notes so that everybody can see that. So those are the 3 portions of the appendix. While we're not going to cover them tonight, they are, they're formative, they're important, and they're the basis for the recommendations that we're getting ready to talk about. So that's what's in the code diagnosis, those 4 pieces. Talked a lot about these key themes for improvement. Here they are. There's 7 of them. Having an easy to use UDO, protecting rural character, implementing Making Mills River, modernizing and expanding the range of land uses, protecting the environment, assuring more housing choices, and promoting development quality. These are the basic themes that we've identified. Hopefully none of these are a surprise. Hopefully everybody agrees that these were the topics that rose to the top in our discussions with you, in Making Mills River, and so forth. So these are the provisions that we are seeking to change. There's a copy of the first page of the code diagnosis on your screen that gives you the sense of that executive summary, the 7 key themes and all of the sub recommendations that are under them. And yes, we are going to talk about each and every one of them, but maybe some we'll spend more time on than others. So before we dive in, are there any questions up to this point before we start talking about the key themes? Everybody good? Thumbs up? Thumbs up.
For those of you who are online and you have a question, and if you didn't type it into the Q&A, you can just push the button at the top to raise your hand as well. Well, thanks.
All right. All right, very good. So here we go. key theme 1. These are pages 7 through 11 of your code diagnosis document, the PDF. And so we're going to talk about each one of these in turn. The first, obviously, is taking these various 8 chapters of your town code and consolidating them into one document, one set of procedures, one set of definitions, one set of standards, instead of multiple chapters sprinkled throughout your regulatory document. We want to create an intuitive document structure. If you look to the left, you'll see 9 entries. Those are the proposed chapter titles in the new UDO. We would start with the administration chapter, obviously applications, the zoning districts, the land use provisions in chapter 4, nonconformities, and the development standards in chapter 6, our enforcement provisions, violations in chapter 7, word usage, which is the rules of language construction, the rules of measurement, our glossary, the definitions, the explanation for the terms and measurements in the UDO, all set down in chapter 8. And then finally, chapter 9, the appendix. That includes supplemental information like site plan requirements, subdivision certification and declaration language, and other things that applicants need to prepare or submit an application. So, intuitive document structure, you'll note they're in alpha sequence. You'll note that most section headings within each of those 9 chapters will also be in alpha order, making it hopefully easier for everybody to navigate the document. We're including more navigational aids, and what we mean by that are detailed headers and footers on every page. You should be able to look at the top of each and every page on the ordinance and find out exactly where you are in the document. Also, there's a PDF version that has a breadcrumb menu that allows you to seamlessly jump across the document in a digital format. Lots and lots of dynamic cross references, hyperlinks that are built into the text that enable a reader to move around the document with ease. One other thing I'll mention is that the page footer will include a basic reference that anyone can click and go instantly back to the primary table of contents. So you can always go back to kind of ground zero or the starting point of the ordinance from any page in the document. So hopefully gone are the days of endless scrolling, and you're able to just jump around the document in its PDF format. We want to have a new page layout, and I'll give you a couple examples of those in a minute. Basically, dynamic text, different colors, different sizes, ways to show dependencies among text, white space to give your eye a rest, new numbering system, etc. So lots of changes there, hopefully for the better. The current regulations have a lot of prose, long paragraphs of sentences that require readers to unwind those ideas to understand the basic essence of what's being said in the code. The new UDO uses numbered statements wherever possible instead of long paragraphs. Much increased reliance on illustrations. You should expect about 300 or 400 illustrations in the new UDO, soup to nuts, everything from development review procedures to zoning district, dimensional standards and precedent imagery, to examples of use types, to how to comply with development standards and rules of measurement and so forth. So many illustrations, lots of summary tables. Instead of rote lists of topics like your current regulation has lists of all the allowable uses by zoning district, one after the other in all of the zoning districts. We go with a summary table. You get the job done in a lot less pages and a lot more information on the page, much easier to work with. Also, these development procedure flow charts. So all of the steps in each application process so that it's very clear and easy to understand. I do this first, and then I do this, and then I do this, and that's set down for every procedure type. Finally, clear, measurable criteria. Every application type in the UDO should include very detailed and measurable review criteria. There's a couple exceptions to that. One is rezoning or text amendments that rely on the legislative discretion of the elected officials. In those instances, elected officials aren't bound to follow review criteria in the UDO, but every other procedure is. So we like to be sure that there's lots of criteria so everybody understands the rules of the game, and wherever possible, we try to make those measurable. Our objective is to make an ordinance that's predictable, that we can all agree on what it says, and that we don't have to spend a lot of time with interpretation and disagreements about what's printed on the page. So those are the 8 aspects of creating a UDO document that is easy to read. And we think if you do nothing else with this project, those 8 things will make a huge difference in your life and the lives of applicants and town residents in the development process. These things are going to make life better. So that's key theme 1. Make this thing easier to read, easier to use. Here's some examples. Obviously, we've got a modern page layout here with the headers and the footers and lots of pictures. We do a lot of different kinds of illustrations and flowcharts and so forth. We do a lot of procedural flowcharts. This is a layout of a zoning district for another code. The purpose and intent, the kind of, I'll just call them imagery of preferred development or precedent images for the kinds of development that are appropriate inside that zoning district, the dimensional standards set down in a summary table, and then a schematic that shows how the dimensional standards are applied to individual lots in the zoning district. And this is all on 2 opposing pages, so I can open the book to those 2 pages and see everything I need to see about that zoning district. Obviously, a lot of imagery, a lot of discussion about what we're looking for is included everywhere in the ordinance. I'll mention to you quickly that while we do have lots of images, the text always controls. And it is possible that you will see images in your UDO that don't line up perfectly with what the development standards call for. It's very, very difficult to find a picture that meets every single one of the applicable development requirements. And that, for that reason, illustrations are suggestions, and we defer to the text in terms of which controls. But the illustrations do take us a much farther distance to the way of understanding. So we like to use those, and we will be using lots of them, particularly in Chapter 6, the Development Standards section. Okay? All right. So key theme 2, designing zoning districts to reflect rural character. Okay, so we're talking about a lot of changes to the zoning district provisions in the current regulation. And that's why I had that long belabored discussion about Session Law 2457 and 587 and 138, and all of those numbers, all that alphabet soup is directly related to the changes and suggestions that we want to make on this slide. And let's talk about those. They run from pages 12 to 14 in the code diagnosis document. First among them is reconfiguring the current mixed-use district, the MRMU. If you look at the map to the left-hand side of the words, there's a big green blotch. That is the MRMU district. 73% of Mills River is designated MU, which is great if you're a highly urban community, which Mills River is not. Further, the mixed-use district has a wide range of allowable uses, particularly non-residential uses that are permitted by right in the district, and there are precious few dimensional standards for residential development. So it's a very open-ended district. It's a very appropriate district in an urbanized area. It's probably not the kind of zoning district that makes a lot of sense in a rural area. And so we are looking to reduce the amount of mixed-use zoning in Mills River. I can't believe I'm saying that. We usually go the different way. But in this instance, there is too much unfettered discretion by this zoning district. And this zoning district, we would suggest, be reined in and located in areas where there is infrastructure, where there are utilities, and where it makes sense to have mixed use, and not to have the tops of mountains or residential subdivisions or farm fields zoned mixed use. So that's a big change. Let's talk about your corridor overlay district. This is a current overlay that you apply basically along 280, 191. And what it is designed to do is protect community character. And that's great. We have 2 or 3 suggestions that we'd like to pose with respect to this corridor. First among them is that many of the design provisions that are embedded in that corridor be removed from the overlay district and applied uniformly across town. That if it's good in the corridor, it's likely good in areas outside the corridor. So we'd like to suggest that. A couple other things. We'd like to revise the corridor to really emphasize screening of development along the highway corridor. And so the base approach is, if you're within 1,000 feet of the corridor right of way, we'd like you to screen your development so it's very difficult to see. Do you have to do that? Answer, no, you don't. But if you choose not to screen your development along the corridor, then you'll need to comply with the rural design standards that we would suggest be applied inside of the overlay district. Things that control building size, building height, parking location, location proximate to the edge of the right of way. Okay, so seeking to foster more small scale, rural style land use on the corridor, the kinds of things that you might see built in the 1960s or 70s in Mills River. Not large shopping centers, not large industrial plants, small rural kinds of development in the corridor. If you want to do a shopping center or a large industrial plant, you'll need to screen it. Okay. Some changes to the overlay districts. Right now, we are suggesting 3 new overlay districts. We're carrying forward the corridor overlay with the changes that I suggested. We're also changing your water supply watershed standards to an overlay district. In central Mills River, the town is subject to these water supply watershed protection standards that control density, they control the range of allowable uses, and we, just for the sake of code hygiene, we would suggest that these be administered as an overlay district. Those are the easy ones. I'll talk about the new ones that you don't have today, and I will kind of ease into that. The first is a farmland preservation overlay. Right now, today, your current regulations recognize the county's voluntary agricultural district and farmland preservation provisions. We would like to suggest that the new UDO incorporate a farmland preservation overlay district that embeds those regulations that you're relying on from the county. Okay, so if you've got a subdivision that's adjacent to a farm or an agricultural use, there has to be a notification on the plat. We would also suggest some farmland protection standards, some lot size changes, some locations of open space relative to farmland, etc. Things that would ensure that we don't have inconsistency or incompatibility problems along the edges of new development and farmland. So farmland preservation, all right? So corridor overlay district, water supply watershed district, farmland preservation district. We talk about the last overlay district. We're suggesting the possibility of a ridge and hilltop protection overlay, some provisions that control the ability of new uses to locate on tops of ridges, and additional standards that control building height unless the applicant chooses to use exterior materials that minimize the appearance of the structure from the valley below. So some standards to protect our ridges and hilltops. Those are our overlay suggestions. We're also suggesting a village center zoning district. One of the things that the plan laments now is the lack of a core of Mills River. There's no real kind of core to the community. And we would suggest that if we are going to use this corridor overlay district to control development, impact, and visibility, that we do need to identify a place where it is appropriate to have more traditional village or small scale urban kinds of development. And that would be a village center zoning district. Where would that be? Not really sure. Likely somewhere at the interchange of 191 and 280, but that's open for discussion. So we're anticipating, 1,000 acres, maybe 800 acres of village center zoning district somewhere in Mills River. A couple other things I'll talk about very quickly. Limiting outdoor advertising. Outdoor advertising is a fancy name for billboards. There are some billboards in Mills River today. You do not have to allow new billboards unless you want to. Some people would have you believe that the federal DOT has control over that. That's not accurate. DOT will rely on local government, and if the local government doesn't want these uses, then they won't happen. So we're suggesting limits on billboards and an increased emphasis on ground-mounted signage that is lower, closer to the ground, not quite as tall, perhaps wider or longer than it is tall. Some people call it monument signage. Talking about establishing some new conservation subdivision options and requirements, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. But we very much want to lean into conservation subdivision, which is very similar to the cluster provision that the town has today, but with some important changes that we'll talk about in a minute. So some kind of really leaning into this conservation subdivision idea, perhaps even mandatory conservation subdivision if you're located within a corridor overlay district. So stuff to talk about and explore. Finally, broadening our open space configuration standards. Mills River, you guys are already doing a great job getting open space, but you don't really distinguish between open space that is intended for kind of protection of environmental resource versus open space that's provided for recreational purposes versus open space that's provided to facilitate gathering of people. The point is there's different kinds of open space, and different uses need to have different kinds of open space, and the development regulations need to recognize that and support that, all in furtherance of our kind of rural character protection provisions. So I know that was a lot. This is an important set of ideas. And I understand that, the proof is in the pudding and we need to see what's in there, but wanted to overview this with you. And so with that, I'll stop and say, are there any questions?
Yeah, just shout it out.
It may not be the right time, Chad, but just the question is, how do we incorporate our Mills River rural residential district that's been passed but not implemented into the UDO with the thought that HB 183 will allow us to implement that? How do we coordinate all that? How do we make it happen, I guess?
Great question. We fully expect to incorporate a new rural residential zoning district in the UDO. We would expect to have further discussion with the community about where that zoning district will be applied. But with the passage of 183, the stops have been removed and the town has the ability to move forward and continue its discussions about where this district should be located. And I know that is still an open discussion. The community has not made its decisions yet about where that should go and what should be zoned rural residential. We hope to incorporate that process, those discussions, as part of the zoning map that we're preparing for the town as part of this process. You will see a preliminary version of a zoning map with the annotated outline, which is task 3. So the next step in the process will be our initial stab at where these new zoning districts that I mentioned before will be located. And not anything that we're married to, but rather something that's provided to give the community an opportunity to reflect on it, talk about it, and for us to explore it and see what makes sense for the community and where consensus can emerge. Good question. Others?
Go ahead, Jim.
This may be a conversation for another time, but it's a conversation that we have had on the planning board, spent a lot of time on it a few years ago. And I'm talking about signs. And when it came down to the final thing, we spent a lot of time on LED or digital signs, and I think they're great personally, and versus what we have now. And they would certainly be an asset to the businesses. Because I've dealt with those type of signs we have now in business, and I've dealt with LED signs. But it's I don't remember exactly how it happened, but when the final ordinance that we were proposing from the planning board came down, all of a sudden, the LED or digital signs was said no. And I don't agree with that. I think LED digital signs, and we spent a lot of time specifying what they should look like, the colors they should be, the size they should be, and everything. And I don't know, like I say, this may be a conversation for another time, but I sure would like to see those signs returned. They are great and they're safe. And trying, particularly if you're a stranger to the town and you're trying to read a sign and see what it is that, yes, they're certainly a lot easier to read than those where you change the copy of it by getting up on a laptop. But I just wanted to throw that out because that's been a thorn in my side for several years.
Okay, thank you for that. And we've got a note about that particular issue. And I don't want to get too far because I could talk about signs for hours. You're probably getting that sense. I love this stuff and could talk about it for days. But one thing that's a little bit different now that wasn't in place a few years ago is a ruling by the United States Supreme Court in a case called Reed versus Gilbert. And we've talked a little bit about this. And there's some things in that ruling that make it more difficult for us to regulate things like color or appearance of signed copy. The Supreme Court does not want us to regulate content, does not want us to regulate anything that would influence the message that's in the sign. Yeah, we can manage size and number of signs and how tall and how bright and those sorts of things, no problem. Where we kind of run into problems is when we have standards that appear to infringe on First Amendment rights or free speech, and so that is something that we'll have to contend with. That said, it is not uncommon for us to include electronic message board provisions in signage rules. There are some uses, frankly, that depend on these kinds of signage. Gasoline stations rely on them. Churches and schools rely on those kinds of signage. And so it is not uncommon for us to address those. And when we do get to the signage portion of the project, I expect we'll have some pretty robust discussions with the community about where that makes sense, how much of the sign can be an electronic message board, and what are some of the other particulars like static time and brightness and movement and so forth. So noted, and we'll come back to it in the drafting stage. Okay. Other questions? Okay. Key theme 3. And you guys are very familiar with all of these policies. This theme deals with the adopted land use policy guidance. What in the heck is that? Those are the goals, objectives, and strategies that are set down in Making Mills River. So these are your development code related land use policy guidance statements. We've got a summary table in the code diagnosis that stretches from page 15 to 26. And I'm not going to belabor too much of our time this evening with all of these points, because I know that everybody is familiar with, you know, what's in the comprehensive plan. We identified kind of the top 10. I'll call them Karen's top 10. And those included following the land use vision map, you know, making sure that we sent development to locations where it was appropriate from an infrastructure or a capacity standpoint, and reciprocally, you know, barring or prohibiting development from locations where it was not appropriate. There's a lot of discussion about design, architectural design control or incentives, you know, reduction of sign sizes, this idea about housing and creating more housing opportunities, obviously protecting open space, limiting deforestation, protecting farmland, all really, really important to the community and kind of front and center on the kinds of things that we're working on. At the same time, communities who don't have a non-residential base generally have higher taxes, and residents would be expected to shoulder, you know, those property taxes rather than non-residential development. And so there is a desire to continue to expand the town's tax base with employment uses, non-residential uses. You have the airport there. You've got a pretty good infrastructure available for these kinds of uses. They're very beneficial to you in terms of jobs, in terms of tax base. And so how can we best accommodate them without interfering with, you know, our rural character, with the farmland, with environmental protection? But it would be fairly short-sighted to turn your back on those uses, because they really are helpful and important for the community. We talked about that village center zoning district, and again, that I don't know if that's the name or not. We'll you know, but the concept is, you know, a core, a center for Mills River, and that's contemplated in the policy guidance, along with just making sure that we've got an adequate transportation network. That one is one that's not super in y'all's control. Most towns, you know, own and operate a roadway system, and in those instances, those towns have a lot of control over where roads get built and how roads get built and what they look like and where they go, because they own them. Mills River does not own them. I think you guys own a quarter mile, a half mile of street in the park. The rest of the roadways in Mills River are either NCDOT or private. So you really don't have a lot of control right now over the transportation network. That's not to say we can't have some standards with respect to how private streets are built, and we can't ask NCDOT very nicely to use their standards that would support our rural community. But you know, ensuring an adequate transportation network will be a challenge for Mills River because you do not own streets and you do not maintain streets. So I'll just plant that seed for you. Not to say we won't have some standards, we will, but they'll be applied primarily to private streets. Okay. All right. So that's our kind of the short list, the top 10, the hit parade of the land use policy guidance. Obviously, there's, you know, 20 pages of material here, so there's an awful lot in those 20 pages about things that we would suggest be done. Each one of these tables gives you the policy, the relevant policy in the comp plan, and the potential disposition or how we would suggest that best be implemented in the UDO. And there's a lot of kind of synergy between what you see in the tables on pages 15 to 26 and the recommendations that you see in the code diagnosis. So that's that. Key theme 4, modernizing and expanding land uses. These are on pages 27 and 28 of the code diagnosis. Now, first and foremost, there's some modern tools that are missing from Mills River's development regulations. First among them is a use classification system. There are 5 kinds of land uses, maybe 6, but certainly 5 kinds of land use classifications. And you've heard of these. These are not strangers to you. Residential, institutional, agricultural, commercial, industrial. Those are the basic land use classifications. Under those are a variety of what we call use categories, things like retail, personal service, office, group living, single living, assembly uses, heavy manufacturing, light manufacturing. So each one of those use classifications has a series of use categories underneath it. And then the individual land uses themselves that are kind of incorporated within those different categories. Okay. So this is a basic system that's in use in most modern development ordinances. It's not in use in Mills River, and it's desperately needed. We also suggest summary tables. There's an example of a summary table from another code up on the screen. We should have summary tables for principal uses, secondary uses, and temporary uses. What the heck is principal use? Principal use is the main use of the site. So in a residential zoning district, a principal use would be a single family detached structure. On that lot, a detached garage or a workshop would be a secondary use. A portable on-demand storage container sitting in the driveway while I moved my furniture out to resand my floors would be an example of a temporary use. Okay, so most uses in Mills River have principal, secondary, and temporary components, or potential secondary and temporary components to them. We need to identify those, establish the districts where they're permitted, the process that we follow to get those uses in place, and clarify the standards that apply. And that's what these tables do. Now, we would also suggest a thorough review and update of the range of principal use types that would be in the UDO. So I'll start with things like co-working space, event venues, business incubators, food trucks, mobile food courts, cryptocurrency, makerspace. Those are uses that are coming along that we're now dealing with in other communities across the state. They're not listed in your ordinance. There are also a handful of other very important things that we need to address, like solar energy conversion uses or solar farms, wind energy conversion uses or windmills, communication towers, data centers, things that are coming to Mills River in the future. So having some standards on the books about how we accommodate those kinds of things, really, really important. We also need more clarity about the secondary and temporary uses. What are secondary uses? Where are they permitted? What are the basic rules that apply to any secondary or temporary use? And then what are the specific standards that we might apply in terms of how big they could be, or where they could be on the lot, or how long they could be in place, or how many times I could have it on the lot over the course of one calendar year, etc. So more clarity there. One of the big pieces that's missing from the current regulation are specific use standards. Okay, so use standards are the set of regulations that apply to a particular use, regardless of the zoning district where it's located. Codes that have detailed use standards allow uses to be permitted primarily by right. Why? Because the standards, the expectations for the use are set down in the code. The applicant doesn't have to guess. The next door neighbor doesn't have to guess. The town official doesn't have to guess or make it up as they go along. The use standards are included in the code. Modern development codes have about 120 or 130 use types, and almost every single one of them has a set of use-specific standards associated with them. Mills River does not have those and needs them badly. So we would suggest that as part of this process, along with a reduction in the reliance on special use permits. Special use permits are a quasi-judicial procedure where a review authority applies some very open-ended and general standards like harmony and safety and public interest to the question about whether or not a particular special use is or isn't allowed or should be allowed in a zoning district. Quasi-judicial, so it has a very constrained process, limitations on ex parte communication, limitations on standing, limitations on discussion, etc. Not a great process. And most local governments in North Carolina are moving to codified use standards, more discretionary, more by right kind of ministerial approvals, less reliance on these discretionary review procedures like special use permits. Okay. So we are going to suggest that for y'all's consideration, and we can talk more about that when we're working on the use standards. Finally, 2025, getting lots of new uses, right? We're seeing banks that have coffee shops and coffee shops that have banks and bars where you can go adopt a cat, or farm to table restaurants where you're out working in the field and you bring the stuff in and cook it and eat it. These are new use types that are not necessarily contemplated or weren't contemplated a few years ago. Now they're with us, and we need a procedure for unlisted uses. Gone are the days where we could simply say, oh, that use isn't listed, therefore it's prohibited. The North Carolina Court of Appeals says that's not good practice, and therefore we need to include a procedure for unlisted uses. One other thing I'll mention, it's not on the slide here, but we would also suggest enumeration of a series of prohibited uses, things that would not be allowed anywhere in Mills River. Like what? Like storage of chemical or infectious waste, nuclear reactor, certain kinds of landfills, things that you probably would want to prohibit, anywhere in Mills River. So those kinds of uses also need to be added to the UDO. So soup to nuts, changes to your land uses, lots of changes to the zoning districts, and so forth. So with that, I'll stop. Questions at this point?
Back to 3 real quick, and that was the traffic, the last item in 3, which was, we control one road in Mill River. Is the pedestrian path that we created going to be incorporated in number 10 there?
Absolutely, positively. We expect to include a pedestrian facilities section in Chapter 6 standards, where we'll deal with greenways, sidewalks, and multi-use trails. So to the extent that the policy guidance for those things exists, we will incorporate that. Where policy guidance is missing, we'll need to talk about it, and the elected officials will need to make a decision about whether or not we move forward with provisions to address those kinds of things. One last thing I'll say on that, and I know it's not very popular, but remember when we were talking about those bills, 765 and some others, there's some limitations embedded in that draft legislation about sidewalks and pedestrian facilities. And if those bills become law, our ability to require sidewalks and pedestrian facilities will be limited in some instances. And I don't want to talk about it now because it's not law yet, but I will say it's worth your while to go check out House Bill 765 or Senate Bill 205 and have a look at those standards so that you know what we're up against. Other questions? Just a little. Okay, everybody good? All right. You guys are doing great. We're halfway done. Okay, key theme 5, protecting environmental and natural features. These are on pages 29 through 31. And some of the stuff we've already talked about. but I'll start with the resource conservation overlay district. And this may be an overlay district and it may be a different kind of an overlay district, or a different set of standards. And so let me give you a flavor of what would be in this kind of resource conservation kind of classification. This would be things like wetlands, whether they're 404 or 401. So jurisdictional wetlands that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers recognizes as wetlands, or NCDEQ recognizes as wetlands. So wetlands. Floodplain. Okay. We know that the town flirted with maybe having some flood damage prevention regulations, but ultimately made the decision not to include those. That's okay. No worries. We can address things like limitations on fill or creation of impervious surface in floodplain areas via a resource conservation framework. So wetlands, floodplains. What else? Steep slopes. Areas in Mills River that have 25% slopes or greater. Those areas generally should not be developed as they're not safe. And so how do we handle lots with those kinds of features on them? The resource conservation provisions set down the rules of the road for how we manage that. Maybe it's an overlay district, maybe it's kind of like an overlay district, but it's not something that we map. The reason why we don't map it is those things can change, and sometimes change frequently over a short period of time, and often rely on some sort of field determination. So I've got it listed as an overlay, but it's it's sort of a special overlay. I'll leave it at that. I talked earlier about the Ridge and Hilltop Protection Overlay District. Remember, that is the set of provisions that are designed to stop the visibility of development on ridgelines and hilltops. This is authorized in the statutes. There's lots of local governments who have these kinds of regulations. They consist largely of setbacks from ridgelines and controls in terms of visibility on hilltops, in terms of building heights and exterior materials, etc. We've got some building material limitations for single family residential. We would suggest an incentive-based approach that limits building height unless you're using materials that are that minimize visibility, and in those instances you might be able to get an additional story of height. There absolutely positively are requirements for retention of trees, and also limitations on exterior lighting from those structures in that overlay district. I'll talk about incentives for sustainable development. So this is really, really, really important stuff, and it involves things like energy conservation, rainwater reuse, additional open space, habitat protection, protection of pollinators, keeping stuff out of the landfill, all the sorts of things that you would think about when you think about what sustainable development means. These are incentives. They are not mandatory. How it works is, if you agree to provide some of these features in your development, then you might be able to avail yourself of additional development potential without having to go through a rezoning. So let me give you an example. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that you have green stormwater infrastructure on your site. You use a parking lot that absorbs water instead of sends water to a curb system or out onto the street. In that instance, you might be able to have a taller building, or have an additional unit or two of density per acre without having to go through a rezoning. And so we've structured these as incentives, reasons for the development community to provide these features. And they have to be meaningful incentives for people to take advantage of them. So we're stopping short of mandates. There's a variety of reasons why, not least of which is We're worried that the General Assembly will come forward and bar our ability to mandate these kinds of things. So we don't want that to happen. And so we're suggesting an incentive-based approach here that's voluntary. We have to be sure that the cost of these sustainable development features are mirrored in the development potential that results from their provision. So that's something that we'll work on with you guys. Implementing better perimeter buffer requirements. At zoning edges where two zoning districts come together and touch one another, it's common to require perimeter buffers. There are usually 3-4 different kinds of them. They're performance-based in nature, and they're designed to create screening and protect compatibility, to dampen noise and help limit stormwater. They have a variety of functions. So kind of tuning up the town's buffer requirements at these zoning edges. I mentioned the water supply watershed protection overlay district. Yes, we want to turn those standards into an overlay district. Also, every so often the state of North Carolina puts out a new model ordinance for these kinds of standards, and your current regulations, I don't think, are current with the current state model. So we want to go in, tweak your provisions, and bring them into alignment with the state model ordinance. I will say one thing on that point, which is, as stormwater technology gets better, these water supply watershed regulations are changing and are permitting increased density per acre with developments that include these new, more cutting-edge stormwater provisions. Now, that might run contrary to some of our goals about rural protection. And so it's really important that everybody pay attention to these water supply watershed protection provisions, because they are not a silver bullet in terms of growth management. We'd like to suggest including disincentives for mass grading. Mass grading is where I've come into a site and I mow everything down and I make these big building pads and everything's flat, and I've gotten rid of all of the hills and topographic relief, and now I just have a flat site with no trees. Sometimes you got to do that stuff, but we would suggest disincentives for doing that. Disincentives in the form of increased review times, disincentive in the form of additional landscaping requirements. If the town is willing, some additional stormwater velocity requirements for sites that have been mass graded. Talk about that when the time comes, but know that we want to create some disincentives for mass grading. We'd like to add some new tree protection provisions, including accelerated credit towards landscaping requirements for retention of existing trees. That's a no-brainer, and we would absolutely suggest that that be done. We also want to change the open space provisions to recognize tree preservation and give that accelerated credit. We want to incentivize retention of existing tree areas by giving those areas credit towards open space standards. We may, the town may want to incorporate some reforestation provisions that, instead of a mandatory retention approach, which is dubious and the General Assembly doesn't like very much, a reforestation approach allows a site to be denuded of trees, but has an expectation that the applicant, after construction, will set aside a portion of the site for use as tree area forever. And so that would be a reforestation standard that we can talk about as we get into those kinds of provisions. Finally, I've talked a little bit about open space. I'll kind of lean into it right now. What we would suggest are kind of 3 basic things. Number 1, every use type would be required to provide open space. Okay. If you're doing a residential subdivision, if you're doing a shopping center, if you're doing a FedEx plant, everybody provides open space. Now, there are 3 different kinds of open space. There's passive open space, which is land that I just left alone. I didn't do anything with it. It's just preserved. There's active recreation land. That's land that I'm using for recreation, whether that's a field or a court or a clubhouse or a pool or a greenway or something that involves some kind of recreational use of the land. Finally, there's gathering area. That's plazas, roof gardens, seating areas, places where people gather, and you should get credit for that. We should encourage and incentivize people to provide those kinds of spaces for residents in the community. And so everybody provides open space. There's different kinds of open space. And then ultimately, the last thing that I would suggest, which is a robust fee in lieu system that allows people to not provide open space, but to make a payment to the town for the town's use in securing open space elsewhere in the community. Okay, this is one of the ways that you can create a revenue stream for the town to build another park or purchase land for preservation or easements, conservation easements, etc. So this revenue stream that could be made available through a fee in lieu of open space is an important tool that needs to be discussed given some of the other goals that the town has. Okay, so those are our environmental and natural feature provisions. Let's talk about more housing choices. This is key theme 6. We talked a lot about this with the community. Obviously, Mills River is awesome. Everybody wants to be there. It's beautiful. It's still relatively affordable, yet things are very expensive, and more so than they used to be. Folks can't age in place in Mills River. Your kids can't come home from college and afford a house in Mills River. And so we've got some problems there. We need to be sure that our employees don't have to drive an hour to get to work. So we need employee housing nearby. And so for those and other reasons, we want to suggest a wider range of by right housing. So the ability to do maybe a duplex without having to get a special use permit, provided that duplex fits with the character where it's proposed. The possibility of some small house, small lot options. I talked about conservation subdivisions. Think about a conservation subdivision as a development where we have concentrated the homes. The rest of the development, at least 40% of it, is set aside as open space. Okay, so I've got small lots with small homes that are tucked away and not visible from off-site roadways or existing residential developments. Those are key aspects of conservation subdivisions. But that allows us to create a wider array of housing types on less land in places that we can't see it, so it doesn't necessarily impact our rural character, but allows us to address some of these other challenges that we've got. And so the conservation subdivision, the pocket neighborhood, which you see a picture of there, the bungalow court, this idea that in certain locations, we've little pinpoints on the map, we've allowed slightly accelerated densities in ways that, provided those densities are hidden from view. That would be the essence of the small house, small lot option. The ability to have accessory dwelling units. Okay, these are happening in Mills River now. You may not have permits for them. You may not even know about them, but people have rentals or rental apartments in their homes. That's the thing. People do it. And so helping those people come into conformity, be legal, not have problems with nonconformities or insurance, that's important. Revenue stream, place for my kid to live when he comes back from college, place to rent out, so I've got some money coming in, etc. Accessory dwelling units are pretty popular, and we should be creating ways for those to happen in Mills River in ways that don't overwhelm our infrastructure and don't negatively impact our rural character. I know we'll all have a lot of discussion about multifamily and townhouse development. One of the reasons why we've had problems with this in the past is that there are insufficient design standards for these kinds of uses. And so we are not asking enough of these applicants in terms of development quality, in terms of appearance, in terms of appropriate location. And as a result of that, we're getting development that's not hitting the mark. And so we would suggest some additional standards, some additional requirements for these kinds of developments, plus a recognition that smaller scale, scattered site, not suburban apartments of 250 units, but maybe a townhouse building of 6 units, maybe an apartment building that's built to look like a house that has 7 or 8 units. That might be okay as long as we've got some standards in place about that. So want to explore that. And then finally, tiny homes, live work units. Tiny homes can be a challenge. We know that manufactured homes are in use in Mills River. They do provide housing for people who need it. Tiny homes can help fill that need and are authorized, in North Carolina. So to the extent that we can utilize those, consider mixing and matching those. Maybe we do tiny house developments that are one of these small house, small lot options where there's 8 to 10 of them. They're tucked away somewhere behind some trees, and creating some opportunity for housing for folks who don't have tons and tons of money, but who need to be able to live close to Mills River. So some options there that we would talk about. That's key theme 6. We're getting on 8 o'clock, so I want to go ahead and ask if there are questions about this. Everybody good? All right. Last theme. Almost done. Promoting higher quality development. Pages 34 and 35 set down the recommendations that we would make in terms of higher quality development. So one of the things we heard loud and clear is, hey, if you're coming to Mills River, we want it to be nice. We don't want to see a bunch of junk here. We want our rural character, but we know development's coming. If it comes, we want it to be nice. It seems reasonable. We would suggest a handful of changes to your design and development standards to help make that happen. The first of which is a set of single-family residential design guidelines. Remember, we can't require these. We can provide them and currently deploy them through the conditional rezoning process. If the conditional rezoning process is taken away from us because of House Bill 765 or Senate Bill 205, then we'll have to figure out a different way to do this. But having some single family residential design guidelines at least gives us a starting point to talk with residential developers about how to do residential development in Mills River in a way that's going to meet the community's expectations. Now, in addition to those residential design guidelines, we're suggesting a suite of new design standards. Design standards control materials, building form, configuration, location on the lot, all of those features of multifamily, commercial. We would also suggest some standards for industrial, as you guys are getting some pretty substantial industrial plant there in Mills River. Obviously, Sierra Nevada is a fantastic example of how industrial development can actually be nice. And it's something that you guys should leverage as you're thinking about new industrial development coming to town. We talked already about the pedestrian facilities and our ability to have new standards for sidewalks, greenways, multi-use trails, and how do I move around a site as a pedestrian if it's a multi-building site, if it's a shopping center or an apartment complex or something like that. How do I get around the site on foot? That's what those pedestrian facility provisions address. We'd like to adjust some of the off-street parking provisions. That's something we'll need to talk with your staff about. Obviously, every listed use should have a parking standard. We should have some maximums in place so we don't have parking lots that are too large. We should have some requirements for stacking and queuing. We should have some bicycle parking standards, some standards for surfacing, etc. So addressing parking lots in a more comprehensive way. overhauling the exterior lighting provisions, limiting light trespass, limiting glare. Dark sky and quiet is part of rural character. And so making sure that we don't have new development that's interfering with those dark skies is an important part of protecting character. Enhancing stormwater regulations, if that's something that you want to do. We talked a little bit about these sustainable development incentives like, low impact parking lots, low impact development parking lots that are pervious. There's some other things that could be done. Not just the mass grading stuff or the green stormwater infrastructure, but some other provisions. There comes with that some expectation of your staff, and we need to talk about what the resources are. But there are some provisions that can be done without being designated as a stormwater authority if you choose to do that. Finally, flexible compliance methods. You can and should have parking, landscaping, lighting, fence and wall standards, farmland compatibility requirements, stormwater provisions, signage rules. You should have all of those things. That's part of being a nice community to live in. At the same time, you also need to have some flexibility built into your systems so that if something comes along that's a good development or that meets the spirit of the ordinance, it can move forward without going for a variance or without going to lawsuit. So creating some flexible compliance methods are a really, really good idea. I'll give you one great example. A lot of places require landscaping. Okay, that's cool. Everybody likes landscaping. That's good. However, on some sites, depending upon where the building's located or how the topography sits, some sites might stay in shade forever. And, those portions of the site aren't going to have landscaping. And so how do you address those kinds of sort of site-specific provisions? You do it with flexible compliance methods, alternative landscaping plans, some flexibility that allow your staff to administer the regulations in ways that don't create problems or that solve problems before they start. So some examples of that you'll be seeing in the annotated outline, which we're preparing as the next step. So these are the basics of promoting higher quality development. Obviously, there'll be some other standards too, but these are the core of the things that we would suggest you consider. And all of this information set down for you on pages 34 and 35 of the code diagnosis. Next steps. It's been a while since we've updated the web page. Karen's been getting on me for that, so I got to get my stuff squared away there. We owe the web page the trip notes from our last trip. We owe the web page this code diagnosis document. We owe the web page this video in more detail about what the town's been doing, because maybe you went to Mills River Day and saw Mike out there fighting the good fight, but we need to get some of this information up on the webpage about what's going on with this project. And so that's coming sooner rather than later. The next step for us is task 3, the annotated outline. And that is where, think of it as a dress rehearsal for the UDO. It's going to set down the structure, the page layout, the numbering. It'll describe each and every section in the new document. It's not going to be all the standards, but it will be a detailed description of what's to be in those sections, along with lots and lots and lots of questions for us to talk about. Finally, a preliminary zoning map. Remember that part of this project is inclusion of a new zoning map, where we have an outside mapping consultant who is working with us on this, and we'll be bringing a preliminary zoning map along for the ride when we begin our discussions about the annotated outline. So that's task 3. We're also due for another visit. And while I'd like to come sooner than August, I think that's probably realistic in terms of our ability to finish the annotated outline, get the preliminary zoning map done, get staff the opportunity to review that, and then come out and have another set of public forums with you guys. So those are our next steps. I think that's it. Actually, are there any questions?
Yeah, comment and question. Can you hear me, Chad?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Perfect, thanks. Comment first. Well, first of all, I could go all night, but I won't. So, a comment, and that is going back to when you were here last time in person, and I remember Jeannie's reply to this, or Jenny, excuse me.
Here?
Either way,
Yeah.
it was the same reply. But you said, do you want to see houses dotted across a landscape with lots of space in between them? Or would you rather see a cluster of homes with space around them?
That's right.
And Jenny's answer was neither. Right. But I will tell you, just as a comment, I just got back from Northwest France. And if you've ever been there, you can drive down in a 4-lane interstate. There are no billboards. So that obviously helps the rural look and feel of it. But also they'll have lots of open land because they have to grow enough wheat for the massive amount of bread they consume at every meal. But they also have homes clustered in the middle of these farmlands with vegetation around them, and you get some sight of that. But the cluster surrounded by vegetation in the middle of farmlands or open field is a very rural feel. I can tell you that. Yeah, it looks really good. It feels rural and so forth. So that's a comment. Question I have though is on the very last thing was establish flexible compliance methods. Knowing the lack of appetite for requirements, as you've noted more than once tonight from the state legislature, I mean, is that 7.7, is that, you're talking about everything, right? Let's be flexible in choices because that's not a requirement. Rather than saying we require you to do this landscaping or to do this, that, or the other, under any development standard of any property, whether it's commercial, residential, or so forth, here are your 4 choices. Here are your flexible options. And that keeps us, and we can control those options, right? But that also keeps it from being a requirement that the legislature in the state of North Carolina might want to look to overturn, correct?
So it's a great question. Often what we see in development codes these days is a variety of different flexibility provisions, right? There's what we would call an administrative adjustment, which is kind of think of that as a staff variance that's very small in its scope. I can adjust a setback by 6 inches or a foot based on some specific criteria. The things that I were talking about, that kind of alternative plan sort of strategy deals primarily with development standards, right? So parking, landscaping, signage, lighting, where we've got unique sites or challenging sites where our standards are sort of a square peg, but what's being brought to us is a round hole. And how do we get that peg into that round hole? That's where that alternative compliance technique works. We talked about design standards. Now, design standards should be menu-based. We should offer someone an opportunity to choose from a suite of options. Here's the 6 standards for commercial articulation. You're doing this development, you choose 4. Which 4? We don't care, but you pick the 4. Can I have 3? No, you got to have 4. Hey, what if I give you 5? Well, if you give me 5, then I might allow you to have more parking or less parking or a larger sign or some other provision. So that's an example of how that flexibility can kind of be worked into it. The one thing that I want to be sure that everybody understands right off the bat is this. Just because we've incorporated flexibility mechanisms into the code does not mean that everybody's going to get a flexible approval, okay? Just because you want it doesn't mean you get it. You have to meet the criteria that are in place. For example, I talked about administrative adjustments, right? That's where staff can deviate from a numerical standard by a very small percentage. One of the great examples of that tool in use is somebody wants to build a house. There's an existing tree on the site. If they put the house in the setbacks, in compliance with the setbacks, they're going to put the house on top of the tree roots. They don't want to kill the tree. They'd like to move the house a foot or so off of the tree roots and closer to the lot line. The administrative adjustment is a way that people can do that in that instance. And so when you see the administrative adjustment procedure, you'll see the instances where that flexibility can be used and the amounts that the staff can grant and the conditions under which they can be granted. So don't think that because I'm talking about flexibility or I've got a flexible provision that I'm mentioning that it's just wild, wild west and you can just come in and ask for the moon and get it. That is absolutely not how it works at all. There are standards in place that you have to meet in order to be able to avail yourself of the flexibility. To your question about the General Assembly, I don't know that we'll ever be at a place where the General Assembly feels good about development regulations. I don't think everybody feels that way, but there are certainly plenty of powerful representatives and senators who do. And so we're always going to be challenged and live under that threat that, you know, that our autonomy can be taken away from us. And that's unfortunate. And perhaps even an abuse of the Dillon statute, but it absolutely is the condition that we're in. It is our climate right now. And I'm sorry to say that. So we're sensitive to that. We're trying to write regulations that don't create a pretext for that to happen. But in many ways, we're pretty powerless.
Well, I just think flexibility or choices or whatever words we want to use allows us to, you know, put in those choices or those flexible options that would allow the applicant, whatever, to do what they want to do, but allow us to you know, maintain, you know, the rural character of Mills River because we've created those choices, if you will, or those flexibilities. So I like that is what I'm saying. And I think that should permeate throughout the entire document, I would think.
Understood and agree.
So my question then is, these are bones, and this is wonderful. I think this is great. This is impressive. That where is the muscle added? When do we do that? And I just want to be educated. I know you're working on it. So when is the muscle added, and when can we implement these things? And how do we implement that? I realized that our rural residential zone that we created and we wanted to implement can now not be implemented through its normal process, which the last step was the vote by town council. That's dead in the water, right? The only way we can implement anything is through the UDO. So that's my question. When can we put the muscle to the bone and begin to implement these things?
Right. Great question. So, you know, and this is an iterative process. You characterized it, you know, perfectly. We have a skeleton now, and it's time. Our next step is to begin to put some tendons and some ligaments and some other things on that skeleton and start talking about how this is all going to work. That's the annotated outline, and that's the point where we're going to ask some fairly pointed questions about, do you want to have something like a rural residential district, or do you want to have a farmland preservation overlay district? So we'll ask those questions before we set pen to paper and start drafting it. Now, let me back up and go to the work program slide. I'm just going to
doing that. Who are you going to ask those questions to?
To you, to the community, and to the elected officials. Obviously, the elected officials are the supreme adjudicators of what we end up doing. Okay, so that is something that you should keep in the back of your mind. They are the body that's empowered to exercise legislative discretion, and we'll be asking those questions of them. Now, we've got kind of two sets or iterations of drafting here. The annotated outline gives us the frame, gives us the numbering system, gives us a beginning point. And then we move into the initial draft and then the revised draft. In both of those tasks, what happens is we draft something. By something, I mean the UDO. We draft the UDO. We give it to staff. They review it. They give us comments. We make those revisions where appropriate. We note their questions. We give them our questions. After staff review, we come to town. We talk to you guys. We talk to the public. We talk to the elected officials. We raise the questions that come up. We talk about the answers. Then Karen and I go back and we revise the language, and we come back again in task 5 and say, okay, last time we were here, we talked about these things. This was the response that we got. Here's how we're going to solve that problem or meet that challenge. What do you think? And so there'll be 2 instances of that. That's kind of, where we are with this. And, we need to compress our schedule a little bit because we don't want to run afoul of our time frame that's been given to us. On the other hand, and don't forget, if the downzoning bill, if Senate Bill 587 prevails or the other repeal bills prevail, it doesn't really matter what HB 183 says because the downzoning provisions won't be in place anyway. So just keep that in mind, and it's a reminder to you that we don't really know what's going to happen, and we're not going to know up until the minute that it happens. And so we're thinking about it, we're watching it, and we're trying to be nimble. That's a very long-winded answer to your question, which is 2 iterations of the draft that happen after we prepare the annotated outline. And we've got our work cut out for us in the next 5 or 6 months as we work through this material.
Thank you. And last point, and that is, I know Jenny and Billy and everybody on the planning board keeps in mind, in the front of our mind, not the back of our mind, that the town council is the ultimate decision maker in Mills River. As a planning board, though, they ask us and task us with planning. So my question to you is, as a planning board, could we look at this and send to you from the planning board some ideas to incorporate into this UDO project?
Yes. We would expect that. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, to jump in on that, that was actually going to be close to my question is what way, as us in a planning board mechanism, is there an approach that you would like us to use so that we can support you in getting this done quicker or more detailed? Just keep on feeding you the information that we've been feeding you so far?
Yeah, I think that's the way to go. You guys have, so one of the genius aspects of your staff is that they created a steering committee that was comprised of planning board members and other people. And so you guys have this sort of in between, right? You're planning board members, so you know what's going on, and you've got an opportunity to have some impact on the draft regulations as they're moving through the process because you're steering committee members. So that's great. And that should continue. The planning board has a formal capacity in this process that the statute set down for us. You guys do have to review this document as a body. You do have to make a recommendation to the elected officials as a body on this document. So, you get kind of the best of both worlds in that the steering committee has an opportunity to be involved as we move along to impact and alter the draft regulations. Thanks, Lisa. As we go along, and then when we've gotten to this task 6, this adoption task, that's when your formal role really gets started. In earnest. But you guys will have already seen the document and been very familiar with it because you're on the steering committee. So, yay for us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I surely do appreciate it. Are there any other questions?
I think we're all set here.
Fantastic. We have recorded this. Staffing. Yeah, great question. And that's a real thing. Not necessarily part of the wheelhouse of drafting the regulation, but absolutely positively something to keep in mind is staffing. I will also say, not to add insult to injury, but House Bill 765 and Senate Bill 205 include collapsed review schedules for almost every permit procedure. So if those bills pass, your staff will have as much to do, but much faster. And if you fail to get the work done on time, then it's an automatic approval. So staffing is definitely a concern. Okay. We will record this, or we've recorded it, and we will send the video to staff, and they can decide if they'd like to post it on their YouTube site. And you know, on behalf of myself and Karen, guys, thank you so much. Really appreciate your attention. I know this was a lot of material. Feel free to look at the code diagnosis and share your continued comments and questions with staff, and we'll get those answered.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a great
Great
night.
All right, bye-bye.